Welcome to the workshop. Today we've got an exciting project lined up, crafting 4 poster frames using just 3 essential tools, but with a twist. First up, we'll delve into pocket hole joinery applied in a unique way that you may not have seen before. Then, we'll tackle the robust strength of hat-lap joints, which will be followed by the precision of tongue and groove joints for that perfect fit. And to top it all off, we'll explore some domino joinery. So grab your safety glasses and let's dive right into milling our stock. So earlier this year, I bought my wife these cool Carnival posters from around our area. Little did I know, it kicked off a journey that could rival a classic comedy or a plot straight out of a 90s sitcom. I'm leaning towards the sitcom, but you might have your own take on that. Anyway, as I'm starting to prep the wood for today's project, let me give you some background on the whole thing. Picture this. There's this guy, not exactly the sharpest tool in the shed, who promised his wife he'd make these awesome frames for those posters. And get this, he decided to use 2 tried and true methods and 2 pretty unconventional ones for the joinery. You know, the kind that always gets the woodworking community buzzing with debates and comments. Like any good controversy, it all begins with me doing what I do best. Ignoring solid advice from real woodworkers like Norm Abram, Keith Johnson, Mark Spagnolo, and Eric Curtis. Instead, I decided to use joinery methods that no sane person would consider for making poster frames. Now that we've got our story straight, let's talk about our special guest star, the material for our poster frames, which is curly maple. It's also known as tiger maple. While I've been filling you in on the details, you've been watching me kick off the milling process. First up, I cut the material to rough length using the miter saw. I measured the height and width of the posters and added 4 inches to each dimension to cover any milling adjustments and margins for error. So these poster frames are going to be in assorted lengths and will end up with a finished width of 2 inches. I added an extra ½ inch to the width to ensure everything mills out right. Oh, and here's a pro tip. Whatever extra you think you might need to cover milling and any mistakes, bump that up about 20%. Trust me on this one. Don't ask me how I learned that. Once I had all the pieces cut, I stacked them up with spacers and let them hang out in my shop for a couple days to chill and see if they would decided to get all wonky on me. So all the pieces were cut a bit oversized, about a ½ inch or so, depending on how much I needed to trim for a nice square edge. I brought everything over to the table saw and set the rip vents at 2 inches, and then ripped them down to their final width. Do you remember when I first cut them to rough width earlier? Well, I noticed some burning on the material, so before I started ripping them down to the final size, I took the first blade off and let it soak in some cleaner to get rid of the pitch and gunk. Gotta keep that blade in good shape. Since I didn't want to slow down the process, I swapped in a new ripping blade to get the cleanest, burn-free cuts possible. This worked well, and all the pieces came off the saw burn-free. Out of the 4 frames I have to put together, 2 will have those nice mitered corners. So I grabbed my panel sled, set the fence to 45 degrees, and cut those mitered corners on 8 pieces that I need. Now, if you don't have a fancy panel sled like mine, no worries at all. You can totally pull this off with a miter saw or even just a regular table saw with a miter fence. Just make sure whatever tool you use can nail those accurate 45-degree cuts. So after I finished cutting those mitered corners, I moved on to making the backer boards for the posters. My wife wanted them mounted with a 3/8 inch reveal all around. The grooves for the backer boards were also supposed to be 3/8 of an inch deep. Follow me so far? So the length and width needed to be the size of the posters plus 3/8 of an inch on each side, right? Well, it turns out my math skills weren't exactly on point that day. I messed up the measurements not once, but twice. Anyone out there need some 1/8 inch MDF in poster sizes? Hit me up in the comments. Anyway, once I finally got my math straight, I started by cutting the total height of the backers correctly and then trimmed the width from the long pieces until I ended up with 4 pieces that were hopefully the right size. I mean, I wasn't really feeling confident in my math skills at that point. So after getting past my little math mishap, or so I thought, I moved on to the last poster frames. Since these ones have pretty square corners, it should be pretty straightforward to cut them to length on the table saw. For the half laps, I needed the frame dimension plus 3/8 of an inch times 2, plus 2 inches for the width of the opposing half lap times 2. With all the caffeine from a bunch of Pepsis I downed earlier kicking in, and after double checking my measurements, I whipped out the panel sled again and cut those pieces to their final length. Now the tongue and groove parts were even simpler. It was just the poster dimension plus 3/8 of an inch times 2, plus another 3/8 of an inch for the actual groove depth times 2. In reality, I made the last dimension a ½ inch, so the tongue would stick out a bit more than the groove depth, allowing me to adjust the fit perfectly. Alright, time to get groovy. I pulled out my stack data set and did some quick calculations for the groove width. Ugh, more math. And popped it onto the saw and got it all set up to cut some grooves. Finally, I can work on all the frame pieces at once. I adjusted my table saw fence to cut the groove in each piece as close to the middle as I possibly could. After running each piece through the data set once, I flip it end for end and ran it through again. This double pass ensures the grooves are perfectly centered in each frame piece. It also slightly widens the groove from what I initially set, which is handy for fitting the backer board and the acrylic later on. After finishing up with the grooves, I moved on to adding a decorative bead along the outer edge of the two mitered frames. I pulled out the router table from its cozy spot in its garage and fitted it with a 3/8 of an inch beading router bit. Funny how 3/8 of an inch keeps popping up, huh? Maybe the universe is trying to tell me something. While I pondered the mysteries of the universe, I also set up the vertical roller guides to keep the material steady as it went through the bit. 2 feather boards help keep everything snug against the fence. With the piece held groove side up and good side against the router fence, I was all set. I have 8 pieces to bead, so I started with the shorter lengths first and then moved on to the longer ones. Okay, here comes the first method of joining, pocket holes. Now most folks know how pocket holes work. They're quick, easy to do, and pretty solid if done right. You start by drilling those pockets into one of the pieces you're trying to connect. Then you grab a screw with a flat head, pop it in, and tighten it up. Since we're dealing with a joint that's at a right angle, driving the screw really brings that joint tight. Adding glue to the mix even makes it stronger. My hiccup here is that these frames that I am working on are only 2 inches wide. That doesn't quite give me the width I need to use pocket screw joinery like it's typically done, where the screws go in perpendicular to the joint. So my first attempt to fix this issue was sticking one pocket screw right in the middle of the board. Total flop. It didn't hold at all and didn't pull the joint together. Next up, I tried 2 pocket screws. This seemed promising, but as I started driving them in, the pieces started sliding along those 45-degree miters. Then, when I flipped it over, one of the screws went too far and busted through the side. Fail! On the next try, I played around with the screw placement until I found a spot that actually brought the pieces together without blowing out of the side. Now that I had my measurements, I marked my reference piece and used that as a guide for the frames. And here you'll see me make a big goof. Pro tip, if you're testing out joinery on scraps, make sure the scraps match the real deal. I have another problem to tackle, how to stop the pieces from slipping up and down on those 45-degree miters. They moved a bit when dry, so I can just imagine how much more they would move with glue. The solution? Clamping the pieces together in the right position and then using a pilot drill bit to make a hole in the matching piece. That way, when I drive the screw in, it gripped the second piece without dragging it along the miter. Now that I figured out where all the screws need to go, it's time to actually drill them into the work pieces. So with the pocket hole jig clamped down on the first piece, I'm all set to drill those pockets, exactly where I measured earlier. Now remember when I mentioned to use a test piece that matches the real deal? Here's why. As I started drilling the pocket hole, you might have noticed the real piece already had the groove cut into it, whereas my test piece did not. As I drilled, the bit got too close to the inner pocket screw location and blew through the wall of the groove. You can see the shavings coming out of the groove instead of the jig, which was a total mess. Luckily, it's on the inside and won't show. But since I'm the one who made them, I'll see them every day when those posters are hung up. It'll be my own little reminder of my mess up. I know, a bit dramatic, but hey, it's comedic tragedy, right? Anyway, I adjusted the position of the inner pocket screw to avoid another blowout and drilled the 3 remaining pocket holes. And just to keep what's left of my sanity, I double checked the last pocket screw hole to make sure it didn't blow through the groove wall again. Now it's time for a bit of assembly, but first I realized the pocket screws in their current positions won't quite pull the joints tight enough, so I need a trick to help with that. Over at the miter saw, I cut up some scrap plywood into 45-degree triangles to use as clamping points. I added painter's tape and glued the blocks to the painter's tape. I've seen this method work perfectly before, but this time some blocks stuck tight while others broke off at the slightest look. With all the clamping blocks in place, I spread glue on all the miter joints and carefully put them together. I started with just one bottom corner to keep things manageable. If I had glued all the corners at once, it would have been a total mission impossible. Tom Cruise might have figured it out, but he's not returning my calls these days. I carefully aligned the first corner and clamped it, then moved on to the second. So far, the blue tape trick was holding up, but that wouldn't last. While they were clamped, I drilled in the pocket screws to secure everything. Once the glue dried on the first two corners, I added the backer board and the acrylic, and then glued and screwed the final two corners together. But hold up, did you catch that? One of the clamping blocks popped loose just as I was screwing into it, leaving no pressure on the joint at all. Off camera, I quickly re-glued the block, applied the clamp again, and this time it held long enough for the glue to set. And with that, the first poster frame was assembled. Whew. So now that I've finished what was supposed to be a quick and easy way to assemble a poster frame, let's move on to one that should be a bunch simpler. But honestly, with how this build is going so far, I'm not going to hold my breath. Using the panel sled, I set up the height of my dado stack to cut away exactly half the material on the top and bottom pieces, each piece being 2 inches wide. I made a half lap joint on one end, flipped the piece around, and did the same on the other end. I repeated this for all 4 pieces that make up the frame. After cutting all the half laps, I'm heading back to the router table to try to replicate that bead detail from the mitered frames. Now, with square cuts, making a square shadow groove around the entire perimeter of the frame is a bit tougher. But hey, I'm not going to give up, I'm going to give it a go. I've got a V-groove router bit set up in my table. I'll start with the shorter pieces since they're easier to run. The groove runs continuously along the whole length. The longer pieces require a stop cut because I'll need to flip the piece to finish at the narrow end. Once flipped, I will make the intersecting groove with the first groove to form the corner. It's a bit tricky, so to be safe, I'm using a miter gauge to secure the piece as I go through the cut. I get it done without screwing up the piece. Sometimes I amaze even myself.
That doesn't sound too hard.
Now that all the details are sorted on the half-lap poster frame, it's time to assemble it. Following the same approach as the other frames, I'll start by gluing and assembling the bottom first. After letting the glue dry, I'll insert the backer board with the poster and then the acrylic. Once they're all in place, I'll glue, assemble, and clamp the entire frame. The assembly process is pretty straightforward and goes smoothly. I use some squeeze clamps to apply downward pressure on the half laps to ensure a solid bond. After that, I set the frame aside to dry. So while the half lap poster frame is drying, let's move on to our third frame, the tongue and groove assembly. Once again, I'm starting with my trusty panel sled. After testing it on a scrap piece of stock off camera, I figured out the right height for the dado to cut the tongue that'll fit snugly into our groove. As I'm milling the tongues on the top and bottom pieces, I want to take a moment to say thank you. If you've stuck with me for this far, hopefully you've learned something or even just enjoyed watching the video. I hope you consider hitting that like button and maybe consider subscribing for more content. I appreciate every like and subscription. It means a lot to me and my channel. Alright, back to the poster frame. After milling one tongue, I flip the piece over and mill the second one. So now we're in the wash, rinse, and repeat assembly stages. Apply glue to the joints in the tongue, and depending on how you're looking at it, start with either the bottom or the top piece. Let that dry a bit, then insert the backer with the poster, peel off the clingy plastic from the acrylic, and slide it in. Apply glue to the remaining piece, align everything just right, and clamp it all up, and then set it aside to dry. You might have noticed that the second and third poster frames went together pretty smoothly. It goes to show that those tried and true methods really do work. Now, we've got one more frame to go, and for that, we're going to bring out the infamous Festool domino. So, for our final poster frame, there are a few things to think about. First off, I've got this Festool Domino 700. The 700 comes with a 12mm cutting bit, so I had to grab a smaller 8mm cutting bit to get the mortises in my 3/4 material. Now, my second issue is the mortise center doesn't line up with the center of the board. To fix this, I had to build a jig, which you see here. This helps me adjust the mortise's position. Plus the jig has a hold down system to keep everything steady while I cut. Now here's where I messed up. The mortises you see me cutting weren't set with what's called the slop setting. This setting lets the domino move a bit, which helps align the pieces a little bit better. When I first tried assembling them, they didn't line up perfectly, so I switched the settings off camera and went back and recut all the mortises. Finally, onto the last assembly. I can't wait to get this done. I got these posters for my wife during the Christmas holiday, and now it's late May. So I'm really ready to finish up this last frame. She's been patient, but I think her patience is wearing a bit thin. She's got the perfect spots picked out on our living room wall and wants to see them up soon. As a YouTuber who works with wood, I never make the mistake of giving an exact estimate of when a project will be done, because I've never been right yet. For this assembly, I'm going back to our trusty painter's tape, super glue, and 45-degree blocks to help out. I'm hoping the super glue holds long enough for the wood glue to set. I apply glue to the joints and the domino, then follow the same procedures that I used for the first 3 frames. Clamp it up, check for squareness, wipe off any excess, and then set the frames aside to dry. And so ends the assembly of all the 4 frames. As I built them, I discovered why you don't see pocket screws or dominoes being used the way I did to build these simple frames. What I thought would be a quick and easy way to use these tools turned out to be more complicated than I expected. When all the assemblies were dry, I sanded them up to 220 grit and used a wipe-on poly to finish them off. After the finish had dried, I installed the picture hanging hardware and hung them on the wall where my wife wanted them to be. And here they are.